In this lesson we're going to look at respiration. The first aim is to compare the process of aerobic and anaerobic respiration, then explain why breathing and heart rate change during exercise, and then finally apply the cardiac output equation. Now I'm going to start off with the most important fact about this lesson. Respiration is not breathing. So many students get confused on this fact. Breathing is something animals with lungs can do. It is just one form of gas exchange. Fish exchange gases through their gills. Frogs can exchange gases through their skin. And bacteria can exchange gases through their cell membrane. But that's not the same as breathing. My point is, every organism, be it bacteria, plant or mammal, carries out the process of respiration, but not every organism carries out the act of breathing. So why do people get confused in the first place? Well, respiration involves oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. And obviously when we breathe, we exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen. But respiration involves a lot more. Now you may have seen this demonstration a number of times in your school lab. It's referred to as the screaming jelly baby, and it demonstrates the idea of respiration well. In this demonstration, I'm using a jelly baby as a source of glucose fuel. I'm using a chemical which is an oxidizing agent. What this will do is chuck out lots of oxygen during the reaction. And I'm using a bit of heat to get the reaction started. Watch what happens. You can see when we oxidize jelly baby, that means break it down using oxygen, we release a lot of energy. And it gives you a bit of an idea of how much energy a jelly baby contains. So a question may be, why is it when we eat food, this doesn't happen in our stomachs? After all, when we eat food, we do break it down using oxygen. Well, the answer lies in the process of respiration. Respiration is a chemical reaction that occurs inside every living cell to produce energy. And the reason why we don't burst into flame with every meal is because respiration releases energy bit by bit, step by step. You see, it's a chemical reaction that involves a series of stages, and each stage will release a little bit of energy rather than all of it at once, because if it did release it all at once, then you would be in trouble. So remember, it's a chemical reaction. That's not the same as breathing. Breathing is not a chemical reaction, and the purpose of respiration is to produce energy. That energy can be used to build up molecules. That energy can be used to contract muscles. It can also be used to divide cells and synthesize proteins. The energy released through respiration is used to keep us mammals warm. And surprisingly, most of that energy is used to drive our nervous system. So, where and how does respiration take place in our body? To illustrate this, I'm using a respiring cell found in muscle tissue. Now, you can see, respiration is a chemical reaction that requires two things to get it started: oxygen and glucose. Oxygen acts a little bit like a vulture, picking apart at glucose, breaking it down, releasing energy along the way. Energy is the useful product of this chemical reaction, but two waste products are produced as well: carbon dioxide and water. So to ensure that respiration runs smoothly, we need to continually supply our cells with oxygen and glucose and find a way to remove the waste products carbon dioxide and water. This is done through our circulatory system. So this blood vessel represents a capillary, a tiny blood vessel that basically delivers oxygen and glucose to single cells. Within the blood, you'll find red blood cells which transport oxygen. So red blood cells will be traveling down the blood vessel. Now, because oxygen is continually being used up in the process of respiration to keep us alive within the cell, the concentration of oxygen within the cell drops. Same for glucose. This means that the concentration of oxygen inside our blood is greater than it is within the cell, because we're continually replacing lost oxygen through our lungs when we breathe. Similarly, when we eat our food, we are continually supplying our blood with glucose, so the concentration of glucose is also higher in the blood. This sets up a concentration gradient for glucose and oxygen, where they are higher in the blood and lower in the respiring cell. As a result, oxygen and glucose will move into the cell through the process of diffusion. So oxygen and glucose diffuse into the cell. Diffusion is simply the random motion of particles from where they are in high concentration to where they are in low concentration. You'll notice that oxygen was transported by red blood cells, but glucose was simply dissolved in the blood plasma, the fluid part of blood. But there's a little bit more. As well as oxygen and glucose being needed, remember that carbon dioxide and water are being produced, so the concentration of carbon dioxide and water are higher inside the cell than they are in the blood. So once again, we have a diffusion gradient set up where the concentrations of carbon dioxide and water are higher here and lower here. As a result, carbon dioxide and water will move into the blood plasma and be transported to the lungs where we exhale them as waste products. So remember, respiration is not breathing. Instead, it's a chemical reaction that occurs inside every living cell to produce energy. It uses oxygen and glucose, which it reacts together within the cell, to produce energy and two waste products, carbon dioxide and water. Oxygen and glucose move into the cell by the process of diffusion, and carbon dioxide and water are removed from the cell by the process of diffusion. If you understand that, then we're ready to move on to the next bit. There are actually two types of respiration that occur within our bodies. One type is called aerobic respiration, and that requires oxygen. So just think of air for air as an AIR because air contains oxygen. This is the type of respiration I have just discussed. So we're reacting glucose and oxygen and producing carbon dioxide and water. You have to write energy in brackets because it's not a physical thing. However, sometimes we simply cannot deliver as much oxygen as our body needs, for example during intense exercise. When we run out of oxygen, we perform anaerobic respiration. That means without oxygen. Look how different the word equation is. Here, we're breaking glucose down without oxygen, and as a result, we produce lactic acid. We also produce far less energy. That's why I've drawn it in small letters, not capital letters here. You'll be very familiar with the sensation of lactic acid building up in your muscles because it burns. This is commonly referred to as a stitch. Now remember, this whole time we've been breaking down glucose without oxygen. When we continue to respire without oxygen, we build up an oxygen debt, or an EPOC. EPOC stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. What it means is that after exercise we need to inhale excess amounts of oxygen to repay our body. So it's a little bit like your bank account being overdrawn. If you spend money beyond your means, then you'll need to repay it to get a zero balance. What this means in real terms is, you see, lactic acid needs to be broken down by oxygen. So that's why after exercise or long intense periods of exercise, people often breathe heavily for a short amount of time. That oxygen is used to repay the debt and break down the lactic acid that's built up within our bodies. So remember the key differences here. Aerobic respiration uses oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, water, and more energy. Anaerobic respiration does not use oxygen and it produces lactic acid. This acid creates an oxygen debt. Anaerobic respiration also produces far less energy. So respiration is a very, very popular topic in exams. In my experience, it's come up every year. What makes it tricky is it often requires you to apply your learning in unfamiliar situations. So here's an example of a slightly more challenging question than normal. Why would an athlete have a shorter recovery time after exercise? When we say recovery time, what we mean is that period where you're breathing heavily to repay your oxygen debt. So here we have a situation where we have a normal person and an athlete. Now, athletes have more muscular hearts because they exercise them more regularly. As a result, they have a higher stroke volume. What that means is they deliver more blood around the body with every beat. And remember, that blood carries precious oxygen. So in this situation, imagine this is a 100-meter race. We've got two lines which divide the race. We've got a pink line, and that represents the time period over which the runner is respiring aerobically. And then we have a blue line, which represents the time where the runner is now respiring anaerobically, without oxygen. So at first, our runner has no problem. They can breathe in enough oxygen to carry out respiration as normal. But after a while, they've used up all the oxygen and suddenly we switch to anaerobic respiration. Now we're producing lactic acid, so our oxygen debt is building up and up and up and up. So this represents the recovery time. Now our athlete, when they're running, they can supply more oxygen to every cell with every beat. So as a result, they can respire aerobically for longer. In fact, they might make the whole race without having to switch to anaerobic respiration at all. But let's just say in this example, they are switching to anaerobic respiration. But you can see much later and for a shorter period of time. This means their oxygen debt is much smaller, so their recovery time will be much shorter. So basically, athletes can deliver more oxygen to their cells with every beat of the heart, and this means they can respire aerobically for longer. This means their oxygen debt will not be as great, so their recovery time will be shorter. So that is how you compare the process of aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So now let's tackle another very commonly asked question. Why do breathing and heart rate change during exercise? First, let's look at a respiring cell at rest. What I mean by that is not at sleep, but just basically sitting down or not doing anything particularly active. Now remember, oxygen and glucose will be delivered to our respiring cells by our circulatory system. That's why our heart needs to beat. The oxygen comes into our body via the lungs, and the glucose comes into our body via the small intestine when we eat food. So at rest, our heart rate is fairly low, so oxygen is moving into our cells at a fairly slow rate. The same could be said for glucose. Remember that during all this, carbon dioxide and water are also being produced at the same rate. So now let's say we're observing respiration during exercise. How will it be different? Well, our energy demand will increase, obviously, because we need that energy to contract our muscles. This means oxygen and glucose will need to be delivered to our cells at faster rate, so our heart starts to beat faster and our lungs breathe faster. So how do we put this in words? Well, firstly, during exercise, our demand for energy increases. As a result, our rate of respiration increases because respiration is the process that provides that energy. Remember, inside our cells, oxygen and glucose are being used up in respiration, and carbon dioxide and water are being produced during respiration. This is all happening at a faster rate by our cells because we're exercising. So breathing rate increases to supply our blood with more oxygen, and heart rate increases to transport oxygen and glucose to our cells faster and remove carbon dioxide and water. It's quite straightforward and logical, but I have seen many students trip over their wording with this one. So do take the time to get the language right, because this could be a 6 marker, and if it is, it's quite easy if you understand it step by step. So now you can explain why breathing rate and heart rate change during exercise. Finally, we're going to look at the concept of cardiac output. That is the volume of blood leaving the heart every minute. You can work out cardiac output by this simple equation. Cardiac output, measured in centimeter cubed per minute, equals stroke volume, that's volume in centimeter cubed, times heart rate in beats per minute. So stroke volume is the volume of blood that leaves the heart with every beat. Heart rate is the number of heartbeats in 1 minute. So if you multiply the two together, you find out how much blood is leaving the heart every minute, the volume of blood per minute. They might give you very simple figures in an exam and you just multiply them together to work out cardiac output. They might ask you to work out one of the other two by rearranging this equation. But the most sophisticated way they'll use this equation is as follows. They might ask you why athletes have a lower resting heart rate, and to explain this you need to understand this formula. So let's take a superhuman athlete like Usain Bolt, who has a very high stroke volume, much higher than average. This is because he exercises his heart regularly and it's very muscular. So when his heart beats, it's a bit like a fuel injection cylinder in a car. Your normal, average, everyday jogger may not have quite as big a heart. As a result, their stroke volume will be lower. So that's the first key piece of information you need to understand. Athletes will have bigger, more muscular hearts than normal people. The second key piece of information is that at rest, our energy demands, no matter whether we're an athlete or a normal sort of person, will be roughly the same. Now we can answer the question. You see, if everyone's energy demands at rest is roughly the same, then everyone will need roughly the same cardiac output. In other words, the same volume of blood pumping around their body every minute, because that blood carries oxygen and glucose needed for respiration. Now, athletes are likely to have much higher stroke volumes because they exercise their hearts more regularly. That means they can afford to drop their heart rate to achieve the same cardiac output, whereas a less fit person will have a lower stroke volume and therefore their heart rate will need to be higher to achieve the same cardiac output. So to get this word perfect, athletes have a larger stroke volume, so their heart rate can be lower to achieve the same cardiac output. So now we can apply the cardiac output equation.